My name is Graham Auld, the Director of the School of Public Policy and Administration here at Carleton. And before we start, I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are gathered this afternoon on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin peoples. We are also gathered this afternoon to discuss a critical sector, a sector full of change and potential, and then one that occupies, as I understand, a significant place in the Canadian economy and the daily lives of Canadians, but perhaps an unrecognized place for many. As the director of the school, I am very pleased to be here with you today, to learn from the panel, to learn from you in the audience, and to support the fundamental work all of you are doing. The school's Master of Philanthropy and Nonprofit Leadership program has accomplished an amazing amount in the short amount of time it has existed since launching in the summer of 2013. Just like the school, this new program has charted an important course and become a leader in the field of education, advancing professionalism within the sectors of nonprofit and philanthropy in Canada. And it's led, of course, by important champions like Susan Phillips, Callum Carmichael, Nathan Grass, Amanda Clark, and Paloma Ragu, both of who could not be here today. And so this event really offers us an opportunity, a critical opportunity for reflection, a moment that helps us understand the key challenges that are ahead and think about the implications of that for research, for training, but also for action. What needs to happen to address these coming challenges, these opportunities that are in front of us. And so I'm very pleased to be here this evening to join in this conversation, and I thank all of you for the insights that you will bring to the conversation to enhance our collective understandings. So with that, I'll introduce Professor Susan Phillips, who will introduce the panel. Thank you.
As Graham said, our goal is to consider what's upon the sector. We're at a time of big changes driven by demographics, by technology, by governments, by funders, by recent court decisions, by the potential of the special Senate Committee on the charitable sector, and more. So our goal is to look at what's upon us and how this might affect philanthropy and the nonprofit sector and what they might do about it. My role is simply to introduce our great panel who intentionally bring different organizational perspectives and different experiences in the sector. My pleasure to introduce Bruce MacDonald, President and CEO of Imagine Canada, Shereen Munshi, Communications Director of the Circle on Philanthropy and Aboriginal Peoples of Canada, Cathy Taylor, Executive Director of the Ontario Nonprofit Network, and Gerry Lutaaya, who is an MPNL alum from the 2014 cohort, and we have a new practice now of including our alum, so all of you who are still in the program can expect to be up here one day. Gerry brings a variety of community leadership experience, including a role as AFP Inclusion Fellow. She worked on the Environics Black Experience Project in Toronto and is currently Advancement Coordinator at the University of Toronto. Our moderator is Joanne Ryan, who is Vice President of Philanthropic and Advisory Services at TD Wealth and Executive Director of the Private Giving Foundation, and one of the inaugural members and continuing members of the MPNL Advisory Committee. Thank you, and over to you, Joanne.
Thank you, Susan. I'd like to offer a warm welcome to everybody, to students and to guests, and of course to our panel. I'm really looking forward to having this conversation. And it is a conversation, so I'm just going to give you an outline of the format. We're going to give each of our panelists about 7 or 8 minutes to talk about what they do within their organizations, what they see the future of the sector needs, positive, what they think is positive, what might be negative. Then after they've each spoken for about 7 or 8 minutes, I'm going to ask them some of my own questions, which I've prepared. But then we really, as I said, we want this to be a conversation. So for the last 30 minutes or so, we are going to open it up to the audience so that you can ask any of our panel members any questions that are on your mind for our panelists. And it's a really great, interesting time in the sector. I have the privilege of working with high net worth clients and helping them to give their money away as opposed to make money, which some of my colleagues at TD do. And I know that just from dealing with donors over the last 5 or 10 years, the donor is very different in terms of what they're expecting from a charity, what they're looking for from a charity, how they want to measure impact. And so the times are changing. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from our panelists in terms of what's in the future for our sector. So I'd like to start with Bruce, head of Imagine Canada, to talk about what's on your mind and what's in the future.
Great. Well, thanks very much, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. So what's next for the sector in 8 minutes or less? Wow, that is one tough chore. Tonight, I really want to talk about 2 things in terms of thinking about the future of the sector. So one is kind of the seismic shift that's coming in individual philanthropy. And the second is sort of some thoughts on how the sector might need to behave and act differently. So I'm hoping that most of you or many of you are aware of the 30 Years of Giving report that the Rita Hall Foundation commissioned that Imagine Canada was fortunate enough to be the research arm for it. There's some really telling data in there that for organizations that raise money from people, they really need to be paying attention to. So we know that Canadians on average give about $14 billion a year. We live in an extremely generous nation. But there's some signs in there that this is softening. As we look at the sort of plummeting donation rate, going from a high in 1990 of almost 30% down to a current low of just over 21%, the number of Canadians who are claiming the tax credit on their income tax, that's a fairly steep drop in a fairly short period of time. But one of the data points I think that's particularly interesting is that we're seeing that there's a potential at about 4.3 out of that $14 billion, 4.3 billion is in jeopardy of actually exiting the system over the next 10 years. And the reason for that is that those donations are made by people who are 70 years of age and over. Very generous, but there is no guarantees right now that when those dollars move from older adults to their middle-aged children, that they won't be used to pay off their mortgage, pay down their kids' student debt, or start bucket list items of travel, boat, cottage, that kind of stuff. So there's questions about the future of what happens with that money. When you combine that with the percentage of donations in this country coming from people who are 40 and under, going from 42% in 1985 to 22% in 2014, we asked some questions. I have to be honest with you, I think young people get a rough go when we start talking about these data points, because we think that the fundamental starting point for philanthropy is different for young people today. When you look at things like high student debt, the cost of housing, particularly if you live in urban communities, and lack of permanent work, when you don't know where your next job is coming from, it's hard to be a monthly mission-based donor the way your parents or grandparents. So, the data tells us there's about a 10-year runway before massive shifts take place. So just to let you know, this is the motivational pick-me-up portion of the evening. So what does that mean for the sector? I have to tell you, first and foremost, I'm an optimist. I believe this means opportunity for us to make significant change in the sector and in society. So I'm filled with optimism, but I also believe there's a challenge, because I want to speak to the way we as a sector function. I think there's a need to act and behave differently to achieve our collective interests, and really address that in 2 ways, one through cohesion and the second through activation. As Susan mentioned, the Senate is studying the sector right now. We're eagerly awaiting the report from the Social Innovation and Social Finance Co-Creation Steering Committee. And as well, we're awaiting a response in the political activity panel report that was submitted over a year ago. You know, these are going to be missed opportunities and future ones if we can't come together as a sector around some common messaging and actually leverage the strength of this sector. 8.1% of GDP, 2 million staff, 13 million volunteers, and yet a voice that's not really heard. It is time for us to come together to achieve our collective interests. And so I want to leave you with two questions as we think about this. So one is, how can sector organizations participate in collective efforts when it feels like this is taking away from cause or mission-specific interests? So when asked to support a letter, contact an MP, we often hear from organizations that, you know what, we can't do that because we only have so much political capital to spend. And if we do that, we don't dedicate it to our particular cause or mission. I think we need to try and reframe our sense that there's probably more political capital that you've got, and that if we all work together on some of these macro issues, rather than fighting for a bigger slice of the pie, we're going to bake more pies. But it's a tough one, because you can hear the conversations at the staff and board tables when there's limited capacity and bandwidth. The second question is, how can sector organizations participate in the promotion of cohesive messaging when organizational leaders may not agree with every word? We've actually witnessed where organizations have said, you know what, we really like those 17 recommendations, but there's 15 we love and there's 2 that we don't really agree with, so we're not going to participate. Or there's 2 words in the letter that we don't like, so we won't participate. I believe that if we wish to achieve our common goals and interests, we have to move past this place of doubt, potentially fear, and say we're going to have some courage to say there are 2 that we don't really like, but we're going to support the other 15. Or here's a caveat for those words that we weren't the happiest with, but we're signing on. Once we start to demonstrate in local ridings, in local communities, our efforts around a real modernization of the regulatory and guidance regimes that govern this sector, which will allow us to unleash the power of this sector, will happen. But we need to work together. So what's next for the sector? Well, I think for me, it's a future that looks different than the past. It's one where Canadians understand and value the contribution made by civil society and social purpose organizations, and it's one where collectively we've worked together to help people understand, acknowledge, and support the sector.
Thank you, Bruce. So I'm hearing lots of opportunity for collaboration and working together and not being so nitpicky on a few little details. And also hearing not so doom and gloom that yes, some of our older donors are retiring, but I think there's lots of hope for younger donors to come on board too. So Shireen, I'm going to turn it over to you and share your thoughts on the future of the sector.
Thank you. So I'm just going to give a bit of background about myself and then the circle and then the work that we do. So my name's Shereen Munshi and I'm an immigrant to Canada. I moved here from Zambia when I was in grade 6. So that was many years ago, and I've called Ottawa home ever since, unceded Algonquin territory. And so a bit about the Circle, because I'm not sure how familiar everyone is in the room about what the Circle does. So the Circle on Philanthropy and Aboriginal Peoples in Canada is a network-based organization, and we serve 2 members. So we have members that are philanthropic organizations, so that's family foundations, corporate foundations, and granting organizations in general. And then Indigenous-led or focused charities, projects, and communities. And the overall goal that we hope to do is to inform philanthropy on how to better serve and fund Indigenous-led organizations so that we can increase the funding on that end. And so the way that we've been doing that, the way that we're hoping to increase this knowledge is through what we're calling a pathway to reconciliation. And the pathway to reconciliation acknowledges 3 different spheres of influence in your life and the importance of being personally involved in reconciliation, so knowing where you stand personally, what's your journey, what's your story, and what does it mean to you? And then from there, what's your community? How do you engage in reconciliation in your day-to-day life? Like, who are your friends? What racial boundaries are you facing, whether you want to acknowledge them or not. It's sometimes difficult and uncomfortable. And then when you have those two as your bases, you're able to function and be and breathe life into the work that you do professionally when you approach how to transform granting systems or to create a reconciliation-focused grant. And so when you do the work through the spheres of influence, we're hoping as a circle to highlight the value of investing time and money into personal leadership development connected to reconciliation, social location, privilege, and equity. And with this heightened sense of awareness and knowledge, we can begin to demonstrate the commitment to reconciliation and collaborate and work differently to address the shifts necessary for the philanthropic sector. So I'm just going to put this away. So I'm going to talk a bit about myself. And so when I joined the circle, I honestly just knew that I had benefited way more privilege than Indigenous peoples in Canada. And so I felt a calling to be a part of that work. And I emailed the circle and I started as a volunteer, and Wanda's in the room right now. And we worked together, and with learning, and I was always able, and still am today, to be very human in the work that I do. And that means that I can sometimes make mistakes. I can sometimes want to learn more. But the one thing that's been clear about the circle is that we're always working and actioning what we want, the change we want to see in the world. Because when you approach reconciliation work, it's sometimes very daunting, and it sometimes leaves people afraid to take a step because they don't know if they're going to do it in the right way, if they're going to be called out for it, if they're going, and all of that stuff doesn't move people forward. And we're staying in this little area. And when I think of what's next for the philanthropic sector, I think of moving beyond reconciliation work to actually start working for equity, for racial equity, for the empowerment of other people, to decenter the whiteness of philanthropy and move where we're actually going to celebrate and allow new voices and shift the narrative a little bit in that way. And so I'm going to leave it off with what I think is next for the sector in general. And I think that it's a sense of an accountability to decenter that whiteness. So we've been, as a sector, doing a lot of learning related to reconciliation ever since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and then the Circle helped to co-create a declaration of action for the philanthropic sector. We've been learning for a very long time, and I think that there's an accountability that needs to come in the future and very soon, where we're going to be like, yeah, we did that learning, and now what? Like, where's the action? Where's the transformation? Where are we going to stop saying like, oh, well, we'll do the conference and focus the conference on this, but then we're not actually going to change the granting or the policy. And that's where I see the sector moving forward and holding itself and each other accountable. I see the amplification of Indigenous wisdom and racialized people in the sector. And I think that when I say that, I don't mean knowing a few people and calling on them many times. I think it's the sharing of opportunities with new people, and opening up the restrictions that are sometimes there, and we don't see them until you actually break down the room and you realize how colonized the systems are that we work in. I see philanthropic leaders adding an active voice in reconciliation and equity discourse. So when something happens and it's fun and it's good to tweet about, there's often you see the messages and the people who want to be a part of the celebration. But when the narrative shifts and there's some difficult news that comes out, it takes a very long time for philanthropic organizations to make statements, or philanthropic leaders to say, you know what, we read that and we're not going to stand by that. I think back to a few months ago, and there was a certain verdict that came out that left the circle feeling like we didn't need to add the voice at that time. Like there was healing to be done with the people that we work with, and so it was time for other leaders to step forward and actually add to that voice and stand up in that way, where we're not celebrating, we're actually just going to point attention to something that happened and say where we stand. And the last thing is just transforming policies, practices, and programming to reflect and embody Indigenous ways of being. And so that speaks for itself, but it's the language that we use, it's the way that we invite people, it's the intention behind the work that we do. And I think for this room, specific to academics, it's really, really great that, you know, you're people looking to better the world and lead social change in many good ways. And while you do that, remember how much language can sometimes be a barrier. And so as we consume and we're fully in this academic lingo, and if you jump into social innovation, it's going to use really fun, big words. But notice that in using those and getting so embedded in that practice, you create this wall where people won't actually identify with what you're saying. And we can lose track of serving the communities who we actually want to serve to begin with. And that's kind of where I'm at.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Shereen. And when I was speaking with Shireen earlier about the circle on philanthropy and Aboriginal peoples in Canada, I was aware of the circle. I've been to some of your conferences, and what I was very surprised about is that it's a staff of 2 that does all of this amazing work. So thank you. And we're going to move to Cathy now, who is the ED of ONN. So we've heard from Bruce, who works with heads Imagine Canada, which is a national organization. ONN, obviously Ontario Not-for-Profit Network, is provincial, which has probably similar but different issues and things on your mind. So let's hear from you, Cathy.
Great. Thanks, Joanne. It's a real pleasure to be here today with all of you. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge that it's an extremely exciting time for this sector. It's a challenging time. It's a frustrating time. It's an empowering time. I think over the last number of years, it hasn't seemed so much as everything seems to be happening at once. And as a team, with my team, we've been talking about we are constantly in a shifting, changing landscape, and we feel like we have to reorient all the time, whether it's with public policy issues, whether it's with media, whether it's election results, whatever that might look like. So I think sometimes we just need to acknowledge that's the landscape that we operate in. Firstly, I'd like to make the point that, in terms of what's next for the sector, I'm going to share a few things that I think we should be thinking about. And the first one is that charities and nonprofits have never been more important in our society than they are today. There's always been a reason why charities and nonprofits have existed, from early days of the Women's Institute to World War II and all of the organizations that emerged after that period. But the issues that our society is facing right now, the opioid crisis, the welcoming refugees, all of the anti-violence issues that are happening in some of our communities, the rise of populism, climate change, nonprofits and charities are working on these issues. They're working to prevent these issues. They're working on the ground to deal with these issues in a direct service capacity. They're working as advocates for these issues. And never has it been more important that our sector be strong to address some of these issues. We are fundamentally solutions builders, and nonprofits and charities have created and been developed to do that, to create solutions for their own communities. Our sector is diverse, as Bruce mentioned, how many organizations. In Ontario, there's 58,000 nonprofits and charities. So a third of the country has organizations are in Ontario. It's an incredible amount of organizations, and yet that diversity is our strength. It's not a risk, because all of those organizations are doing amazing, interesting, unique things in the community. And I'll talk a bit about in a minute about, do we have too many of them? But now more than ever, our communities do need these organizations to survive and thrive. I think that the second thing I want to mention is that we have to articulate both the economic and social impact of what we do. We have actually done ourselves a disservice by not talking about the economic impact we have. We hire people, we pay taxes, we own land, we pay leases, we purchase equipment and supplies. We did a quick survey of a number of organizations and spent millions of dollars on procurement and office supplies in Ontario alone. And we contribute to our local economy, and those GD numbers that Bruce mentioned is larger than many industries. We don't talk about ourselves like that. Government absolutely does not recognize our sector as that way. So we need to think more about how we communicate and some of those messages around our economic impact. Because if you talk about our social and economic impact together, we are a force to be reckoned with, which is powerful, and we need to own that. And yet, based on those two first observations, our relevance and impact is not matched by the recognition and support that our sector gets. And so what's next for us is to figure out why that is and how we can grow that relevance and impact. We still struggle with an identity problem. Often, I talk all the time about we are a sector who's defined by what we're not as a not-for-profit rather than what we are, which is organizations that serve a public benefit. Our funding systems change around us without our input, often without our participation. Government policies are slow to take our views in perspective, if at all, and we have some great examples of those right now. Fighting for funds for core operations and proving our worth is an ongoing and frustrating challenge, no matter what type of our subsector you work in. And those really innovative financing models that are emerging, still aren't practical enough for small to medium-sized organizations, which is the bulk of the sector in Canada. So we're still not doing well. We need to be smarter. We need to be more strategic, and we need to spend less time in firefighting mode. Many of us spend all of our time trying to keep the doors open, and we don't use the strategic mindset we have. There's a couple of opportunities, though. New governments present both challenges and opportunities. I was reminded recently of a quote by a thinker that I valued very much, Brenda Zimmerman. And one of the things that she said was, things that have never happened before happen all the time. And that struck me particularly as we're dealing with a new government in Ontario right now. And it feels like everybody wasn't prepared for change. We have changes in government all the time. Every province in this country is looking at a change in government in the next couple of years, a federal election next year. And so we need to learn from those experiences, not feel like, oh my gosh, the sky is falling, that we can't figure out what the solutions are. There are always opportunities. There are going to be challenges. There's no doubt about that. But there are opportunities. And part of, and we spoke yesterday with some of the students about public policy being a long game. And sometimes that long game, I will be the first to say, is incredibly frustrating. We want to get change happening now. But part of that long game is that we fundamentally have to build relationships on an ongoing basis. And our sector is really good at building relationships. That's what we do with our participants, with our donors, with our clients. And we can do that in a stronger way. So fundamentally, I think a few things that we need to think about in terms of the future of the sector. We have to work differently. The same old is not going to work. We have to collaborate more, and I mean real collaboration. There's lots of talk about collaboration. There's lots of examples of collaboration. I think there's a lot of information sharing and a lot of coordination happening in the sector, but I actually don't see a lot of examples of real collaboration, where we focus on what our missions are and what we're there to do to serve our communities and not worry about the impact in our single organizations. And I think if we really thought about collaboration, if we're really here to do a certain topic and not worry about this, what does it mean for me, or what does it mean for my staff or my organization, we can very much more creatively address some of the issues that we're trying to solve. I think focusing on the bigger picture is hard. It's particularly hard for governance, for our boards, when their jobs is to make sure the organization is healthy. But at the end of the day, the difference between nonprofits and charities and the other two sectors is that we're there, led by communities, governed by community, to meet a community need. However we define community, whether it's an international community, a local community, a community of a certain type of population. I think we need to think about new opportunities and new structures such as shared platforms and trusteeships. Quite frankly, I think we simply, it's not a good enough reason to start a charity just because you have a good idea. One of the questions I get asked all the time is, do we have too many charities and nonprofits in Canada? And my answer is yes and no. Are we duplicating efforts out there? Absolutely. Do we need this many charities and nonprofits doing some of the same things? Probably not. But in a healthy democracy, a group of citizens can start a nonprofit to meet a community need, and who are we to say that they can't do that? So I think, we don't need to restrict nonprofits and charities from registering and starting up, but we really need to encourage them to see what's going on around them. How can we collaborate? And existing organizations, especially ones that have been around a long time, we need to actually adapt better. We need to be more open to new ideas and new initiatives. We need to be more flexible on how we do things, just that we can bring in some of these great new ideas and concepts without everybody feeling like they have to start a new organization. I think there are issues of work in the nonprofit sector and employment that we need to address in the future if we're going to succeed as a sector. We've been doing some work on something called a movement for decent work, and part of that is acknowledging that we have in Canada 2 million workers, and often our staff are one step away from being the vulnerable clients we serve. So we need to do a better job of employee benefits and pension plans and longer term contracts and precarious work. And there are ways that we can do that without saying we have no control, we just simply don't have enough funding. I think we need to own these issues and we need to take some action, and I'll mention a couple ideas on how to do that. And finally, there's our issues around data, and I know there's some people in this room passionate about data. Our sector has a huge opportunity to collect data, to use data, to access administrative data. Governments have to use data in a way that's different than it's been used before. And we're sort of behind on the technological side of things, and I would encourage us to think about how we can use data and access data in our work going forward. And finally, I think there's a huge opportunity for us to think about intersectionality. So when we talk about the work that we have to do, what is the impact on women and gender in the workforce? What's the impact on racialized communities? How are we slicing and dicing our data? How are we thinking about our work from an intersectional lens? And I think that will really help us think forward about how we can do a better job of meeting our missions. So overall, I think one of the messages I'd like to leave with you around the future of the sector and where we're going is that, we often complain about the system, but we are the system. We can influence the system, or we can change how we handle the system. So sometimes often I hear from organizations, well, we'd love to do that, but we don't have enough money. Or I'd love to do that, but my board isn't on side. Or there's I can't find a partner, an organization to do that with me. We do have a lot more control than we think we have. We are independent organizations that have our community support in some way, otherwise we wouldn't exist. And we have to own more of our power in terms of how we activate and how we get involved and deliver our missions and services. Ultimately, we are our own advocates. We can't wait for someone to advocate for us. And one of my early learnings at ONN was thinking, if I just shared information with government, they would advocate for us. They would figure it out. They would do that. That's not going to happen. We are the advocates. And we have to own advocacy with a capital A, regardless of whatever political panel discussion happens. We have to consider what our role is in that and be strong and take a strong voice and realize that we do have a sphere of control over our future. So I think the next, I feel like we are at a crossroads, and the next generation of leaders, the next wave for the philanthropic and nonprofit sector will require us to work differently, to think differently, to have new information, if we want to keep the focus on the issues that we really care about.
Thank you, Cathy. And Cathy with the ONN is a great example of collaboration, because I understand that you are the only provincial network in Canada, but you're working to help other provinces get up and running, which is absolutely fantastic. So Gerry, we'd love to hear from you about the future of the sector, but before you go into talking to us about the future of the sector, I just want really, really high level positive things you got out of MPNL and how it's helping your career today.
No negative, just no negative.
No, I'm very, very happy to be back. I was thrilled to receive Susan's email inviting me back. I'm so honored. And I also just want to take a moment to say how excited I am to be on a stage with Bruce, with Shireen, with Cathy, and with Joanne. They are people that I've admired while working in the nonprofit sector, and so to be invited and be a part of this panel is a huge honor. I've admired all of them from afar, and we've just met this evening, but they are people that I've definitely had my eye on through my work in the sector. So my experience in the program was wonderful. I had looked at graduate programs across Canada, and this was the only one that I applied to. It was the only one I was interested in. I knew that it was unique in what it could offer with respect to a focus on the nonprofit sector in Canada. I'm sure many of us are aware that a lot of people go to the States to do their masters in philanthropy and nonprofit leadership because there isn't anything offered in Canada, and so it's an incredible opportunity. I loved being in the program. I had colleagues from all walks of life, people who had just graduated from university up to executive directors, very senior leaders, and I felt like our particular cohort had a very cohesive, we were a very cohesive unit. And they are, it was a great way to meet people, learn about their experiences and all the different walks of life that they were at. And personally, I love learning. I'm a lifelong learner, so the opportunity to be back in the classroom and learning all types of different topics and was like just awesome for me. I miss school, so maybe there's a reason why I'm working at the University of Toronto and in that way. And so I just also wanted to take a moment. I would love to just get a show of hands of current MPNL students. I just want to take a moment to recognize who they are, because I've been there. I know where you are. I know that you're all working very hard. I know that you've been here for 2 weeks now. This is your summer. Some of you are still working, full-time jobs. Some of you have responsibilities. You're writing papers. Some of you are perhaps hoping to finish your capstone very soon so that you can graduate. And I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge you and to say that I see you and I know how hard it is. But to keep going, it's worth it. And when I think about what's next for the sector, I have some thoughts here, of course, but I also think that it's right here in this room, and it's in all of you. And I appreciate all the thoughts that my colleagues and that I have to share, but really it's also all of you. So if I didn't have perhaps like 6.5 more minutes, I would just be like, I'm done. Like, that's great. Like, everybody's here. But really, truly, honestly, like when you graduate, many of you are already working in the nonprofit sector. But when you come out of this program, it's a whole new ballgame. And I just want to say thank you for the work that you're doing to contribute and continuing to contribute to the sector. And we need you. So thank you. Thank you for being here. And so I want to talk about two things really, really quickly. I want to first talk about millennials. And I kind of want to take a response to what Bruce said about that $4.3 billion that is exiting the sector from people who are over 70 years of age, and perhaps put forward the idea that millennials can perhaps fill that gap. We as a millennial myself, I can speak to this, and also I remember some of my readings while I was in the program. I don't know if it's still required reading, but the Millennial Impact Report is something that we always had to read. And we know that more than 2/3 of us already donate to charity, and that 50% of millennials are interested in monthly giving. Millennials make up 27% of the Canadian population, which is about the same size as the boomer population. And we also make up the largest proportion of the Canadian workforce at 37%. So I think the question to consider is, will millennials donate? Will millennials continue to donate and support the charitable sector? We have a lot to bring to the table in terms of volunteerism, activism. We're often pegged as the generation that uses social media very intensely to communicate and advocate for a cause that we care very deeply about. And I think we have a lot to offer. But I think there's also a question of the fact that I can't answer that and I can't determine that, and neither can millennials. It's really about considering the way that charities and nonprofit organizations are engaging with us, engaging with millennials, as volunteers, as donors, as employees. And so when I think about my giving and my involvement and my commitment to the nonprofit sector, I'm looking for things like, are organizations mobile friendly? If I'm on my phone all the time now, it's literally a computer in my hand. And so if I go onto your website and it's not user friendly for me to make a donation, if there's not something quick and catchy, it's very likely that you're going to lose me. So I think that organizations need to be reflecting internally and asking themselves some questions. Are you active online and across different social media channels? Is your website mobile friendly, particularly for online giving? Are you sharing impact stories so we know that donations are going to good use and also going where you said they would go? Are my values being reflected in your organization's work and services? And often I think this is easily forgotten, but have you asked us? have you asked us if we can give? Because I think a lot of the times that's very, very much just overlooked. And, you know, I think having done fundraising at some organizations in the past, we know the power of sometimes donors just haven't been asked if they can give more. We know we have so much information on donors. We know their giving capacity. We know they can make a gift that's $10,000 more, but we don't ask them, and we leave money on the table. And so I think there's certainly a lot of potential with millennials. It's really just a matter of organizations, of charities doing a better job of seeking us out, communicating us, and communicating with us, and seeking to understand how we can work together and better. And then secondly, I also want to talk about diversity. And so when it comes to diversity, I was hoping to draw upon readings from my time in the Masters of Philanthropy and Nonprofit Leadership program. But interestingly, perhaps not terribly surprising, there were not a lot of options for me to choose about. And so I started the program in 2014. And at the time, diversity and inclusion wasn't really a topic that was being talked about as mainstream as it is now. But it's definitely more common when you're applying to jobs. You see that statement at the bottom of the job posting that says we welcome people from diverse backgrounds to apply, and it's probably a section in organizational policies saying that, you know, we foster a diverse and inclusive workspace. But I think that this has become increasingly common, which is great, but we need to do more, and we need to be working like beyond just this surface level, what I would say is a performative state. So when it comes to long-term change and true impact, I would say that the nonprofit sector is stalled because of its resistance to embrace diversity in a way that is reflective of the communities that we are trying to serve. And I've been reflecting on this a lot, especially in the last couple of months. And I always go back to a quote to a statistic that I came across in a survey from the HR Council for the Nonprofit Sector, which revealed that 90% of employees in the nonprofit sector across Canada identify as white. And for me, this is particularly startling. I live in Toronto, and I try to keep in tune with what's going on in the city. And there was a census that came out just in the fall that said over 50% of residents in Toronto identify as visible minorities. And so for me, that really doesn't line up with what we're seeing in the sector. And so I believe that we really need to focus on embedding greater diversity in the workplace and across the sector. And this is incredibly obvious because there are so many reports and so many studies which prove that diverse teams increase organizational performance. They boost the quality of decision making and produce higher levels of innovation, while also resulting in higher employee satisfaction and lower turnover. So with all of this in mind, I'm left wondering, with everything that I've just presented, we only stand to gain when we incorporate diversity into the workplace. And so knowing this, why are we not doing this? Why are we not striving to make all levels of organizations more reflective of the diversity that is in the communities? And I speak from a place as a Black woman, but I recognize that I have my blind spots, and that does not include Indigenous peoples, that does not include people with disabilities, that does not include people from the LGBTQ community, as well as so many other people that I am not always keeping in mind. But with respect to diversity, I think it's very important that we consider the way that charities are doing this, because it's really holding us back. And as a sector, if we really are of the mind that we want to do better for ourselves, for our families, for our communities, and for the world, we need to accept that we are not performing at our full potential, and we need to do what we need to do to make sure that we get there. So the nonprofit sector needs much more diversity than it has now, especially in positions of leadership. And I believe that for this to happen, the sector must acknowledge and confront existing challenges such as bullying, harassment, racial discrimination, gender bias, Islamophobia, microaggressions, unchecked power and privilege that happen at significantly disproportionate rates to individuals who are not part of dominant white culture. Because if these types of behaviors continue to permeate in our workplaces, the future of the nonprofit sector is incredibly bleak. And so we must commit to dismantling any further perpetuation of a model that was designed for the success of only a select few, and move towards more equitable distribution of power and decision making at all levels. Now, I know that's a lot. And of course, it requires a lot of work from all of us. But I would encourage everyone to reflect and see how you can do that on an individual level, because it will take all of us. And it will be hard work, and it will be uncomfortable at times. But I think thinking about the future of the sector, it's certainly worth it. And I know it's easier said than done, but I always go back to a quote by a woman named Rosemary Brown that says, "Until all of us have made it, none of us have made it." And so even as we continue to achieve certain milestones, if there are still people who are being left behind, then everything that we're doing in vain. And I think that we can all agree here that we want what is best and what is better for the sector. And so we have to make sure that we all continue to move along together as a collective unit. Thank you.
So thank you, Gerry, for giving us faith in millennials and hope, and also for opening our eyes to the fact that the not-for-profit sector needs to focus on diversity, just as the for-profit sector is, and that there's still lots of work to do. And thank you for raising that. So I'm gonna go to Bruce. I'd like to chat with you about evaluating and ranking charities, because I'm out talking to donors all the time. They're wanting to make smart philanthropic decisions. Some are going to websites that have ranked charities in a particular order based on set criteria. They're actually looking for this information. Some are focusing it just on financial information and a certain line on your financials in terms of money spent on administration and salaries, etc. What advice would you have in terms of helping the average donor figure out and navigate their way through the charitable sector to be able to make smart philanthropic choices?
The average donor?
Well, the average donor, the average donor, sophisticated donors. I mean, I was with a donor yesterday, and she had pulled from a website. She had pulled a list of charities, and that were specifically focused on women, women and education and reproductive rights, and she was trying to rank them, and she was asking me questions, and I mean, she's very intelligent and wanting to do this in a very, very thoughtful manner.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll be honest with you, I don't know if we have a great answer for the individual donor on this one, because it's really a fascinating sort of environment in which the sector operates. There is clearly consumer demand for speed, comparability, those kinds of things. People want quick answers. I'm trying to figure out who to give to. Can I find a website or a mechanism that ranks? At the same time, those of us in the sector, many of us are quite offended by the methodologies used when there's not a universal methodology. How do you compare the impact of an organization that's digging wells in Kenya to a needle exchange program on the east side of Vancouver to working with Inuit children in the north to homeless in downtown Toronto? I mean, the last service organization I worked for, we had 5 different evaluation methodologies for 5 different programs. And yet, there's consumer demand. And, at Imagine Canada, we've agonized over this question for quite some time, I have to say. And I'll be honest with you, our answer, to a certain degree, is to sort of ignore the question. And kind of use a good old West Wing. We refuse to accept the premise of the question. And say, why are we continue to play defense on somebody else's field? Let's go grow new grass somewhere else. And I think, to a certain degree, if we as a sector reframe and invite donors in an easier way, in a meaningful way, to take a look at the effectiveness of the work that we do, be honest and transparent, and sometimes say, yeah, it didn't work the way we thought, and we're going to learn and adapt and change. I think we have to recognize that the definition of transparency has changed, and that if you're not doing the bare minimum of posting, your audited financial statements, who's on your board, your impact reports. Donors, if they're not on their phone, going right past you. We have to be open and welcoming. I think, unfortunately, there's going to be a segment of the population who wants an easy decision. But there's many donors who really care about where their dollars are going and where their contribution of time is going. And they're going to spend the time and energy and looking for it. And I think to those donors, those are the ones that we want to attract by talking about the work that we do, inviting them and engaging them in that conversation. And I think there's a chance there for a really authentic relationship with them. Mm-hmm. If those that are just going to go to the rank, they're going to go. The horse is out of the barn on this one. And we can't invent a universal methodology. We actually floated the idea of a trip advisor for the sector. Let's invite Canadians to talk about their experiences. Well, the eyes of many sector leaders just bugged out at that point, so we sort of backed off and said, let's go a different route at this point and say, let's go organization by organization.
Okay, so it's not easy. There's no real quick solution for this. So Shireen, I think the Circle is doing great work and trying to educate especially foundations and people that are interested in helping Indigenous peoples. So, I mean, we've all acknowledged truth and reconciliation, but what is holding us back from making more progress? What would you say to a foundation that's really committed to helping? What could they be doing that they're not doing today? Any advice?
I think that it comes down to actioning the learning that's happening. And I think that it depends on the foundation. So if the foundation's main group is women and helping women, then it's to go and find what's the community around you and what is not working for the community around you. Like if you invite Indigenous leaders and Indigenous-led organizations who are facing challenges accessing the funding, it's to break down what those problems are and then work together to solve the issue. I think that what's holding foundations back is this fear of doing it in a bad way, in a wrong way. And I think that there's many organizations out there and many opportunities for foundations to learn about how they can inform their granting and how they can find ways to fund charities that aren't charities, like Indigenous Climate Action are doing amazing work, but they're not a registered charity because that restrains the amount of work that they can do. So it's putting the onus on the foundation itself to find a way to support them and not say, okay, you're doing a million things in one, and then find a way to fill out this grant application so that we can help you. It's doing the work on your end. Because there is you have the hands at foundations, you have the resources, the funding, and it's to use that time wisely and to respect the time of the Indigenous organizations or communities that are doing hands-on work and are ready to accept funding.
So sometimes it's the bureaucracy, it's the paperwork, and the questions that we're asking them that maybe we need to customize.
Yeah, well, maybe not the questions, but also the policies. And being willing to change those and not being so adamant that those things cannot be changed. It's changing the things that on our end and not saying, well, actually fill this box out because it will work in your favor, but it's not really applicable. It's just saying, why is that box there to begin with if you didn't need to have that box? So reflecting on own practices and policies.
Great. Well, thank you. So Cathy, we have a new government in Ontario, and I know that your organization is nonpartisan, but I understand that you're worried a little bit about some challenges and also some particular sectors and we talked about the environment, we talked about women, we talked about gender-based violence, we talked about immigration. These are huge. So okay. You have to work with whatever government is there, and tell me why you're worried about this, and what can you do?
No, it's a great question. I think with any government, with any change and transition, there's always an uncertainty and unknowns about what's going to happen. And in this particular case in Ontario, we didn't have a platform for this government ahead of time, so we weren't quite sure what to I think, as Ontarians, what to expect once they got elected. There are a number of organizations and subsectors, we call them subsectors in Ontario, that are concerned about the future, their future with this particular government, and I think the same is to be said in other provinces across the country. I think there are some of the public information that's already been out there, so changes to climate change has meant that organizations that were getting funding already through the cap and trade program, they've already had their transfer payments canceled, their contracts have been canceled, they've been asked for their funding back from government within 2 weeks of the minister being appointed. The Ministry of Status of Women of Ontario has been cancelled entirely. There's no longer a ministry responsible for the status of women. There's no longer a separate minister for Indigenous relationships and reconciliation. A ministry has been created that includes citizenship, immigration, children and youth services, community services, women's issues, all in one ministry. So some of the concerns for sure are about how will the different voices and perspectives of the organizations that partner with government on a regular basis, not just receive funding, but also partner with government, how will they be received? Our perspective is that this is a marathon, not a sprint. It's not going to be helpful for us in the short term to be against everything, but to figure out what can we be for. And so we're looking for opportunities, certainly meeting with officials. I think my greatest worry is that different parts of the sector will be so worried about keeping their doors open that they won't advocate together as a sector, as Bruce mentioned. So when there are opportunities for us to advocate as a sector, organizations are going to be, I've got to focus over here. Like I'm quite worried about what's happening here. So that feeling of dividing and conquering is real. And so this is an opportunity. This is a bit of a test, quite frankly, for the sector to figure out, what can we advocate for together? How can we support everybody and the work that they're doing? And also, how can we change? Some organizations, some subsectors, there may be models that are better for them. You're more independent if you have more earned income than government grants. You don't want to find that out with a letter in the mail that cancels your contract. But how do we think about new ways of doing business at the same time? So I would say that one of our lines around this right now is we don't know what we don't know. It's too early. We're seeing this as a marathon, but I think it's something that we're all going to have to pay attention to here.
Mm-hmm. And also, I think you mentioned the cancel of the increase in minimum wage. That has a direct impact on the nonprofit sector, where you feel many are underpaid, and we're relying on that.
Absolutely, I think so. That's not been an official legislation yet, but we're expecting that the minimum wage, which is slated to go up to $15 an hour in January, will likely not go up at that point. And I think it both has an impact on the communities we serve. So many organizations in our community serve vulnerable populations, and that minimum wage is good for them. And as a sector, it's good for our employees. So again, many organizations were involved with advocating for that, and it's a good example of playing the long game, because there was a lot of celebration that was won. We got a higher minimum wage in Ontario, and how quickly things change, and how we have to continue to keep our advocacy muscles in shape, because things change all the time, and we have to be called back to work on some of the issues that we have worked on previously.
And I think you mentioned, we need to look at how organizations can look to partner more versus holding their hands out, asking for money. So I think that's
and I think we can all agree that charitable model from years ago and the perception that charities are just out there with their hands out. I mean, we all know that's not how it works. We all know that that's not what happens, but the perception is still there. Mm-hmm. So how can we think of ourselves? We're using language with the provincial government that we're your investment partners, we're your accountability partners, because we are accountable for the funds. We're not just at the door with our hands out to feather our own pockets. We're doing important work on your behalf for the taxpayers, and those are messages that we have to own, I think, in a stronger way.
Great, thank you. So Gerry, I understand you worked previously worked for Stephen Lewis Foundation, one of my favorite organizations, and doing, small, not tiny, but mighty. And now you're with U of T. So I'm just kind of curious what differences that have, what's it like, working with first Stephen Lewis Foundation and now U of T, where it's so huge.
Yeah.
I mean, any highlights you want to make?
Yeah, so for those who aren't familiar, the Stephen Lewis Foundation is an organization. It's based in Toronto, and they do work with the continent of Africa, primarily around HIV and AIDS. And the work that I did was on something called the Grandmothers to Grandmothers campaign. So I worked with volunteer groups. So I see a lot of nodding heads in the audience. I worked with volunteer grandmother groups across Canada and supported their fundraising efforts. They were primarily doing fundraising to support grandmothers on the continent. And to date, I believe they've raised over $24 million. And so this is a volunteer run type thing. We are more so in the background supporting them, but they are the ones running the events in the communities, going out, knocking on doors, getting every single dollar. And so it's really incredible. And I think the campaign's only been around, this specific campaign has only been around for about maybe like 10, 12 years now. So they're doing incredible work. And a lot of the groups are quite small. So the Stephen Lewis Foundation, it's an organization about 40 people total in staff, and University of Toronto, I don't know how many people there are, maybe something like over 20,000 perhaps, maybe. And so there's definitely differences in that, even just in terms of staff size. Of course, when you're working at a smaller organization, if you have an idea, if there's something that you want to implement, it's easier to shift and pivot. There's less levels of, I guess, authority, you could say, and where things need to be passed and approved, and things can change very quickly. Whereas at U of T, there's definitely a structure. So I work primarily in the University Advancement, and so I'm responsible for the professional development sessions that are put on throughout the year. And so obviously there's a cycle, there's an event, or there's a workshop or a professional development session every month. There's a caterer that we use. There's objectives and talking points, and things are done in a very certain way. But there's also, obviously a bigger university. There's tons more resources. We have a lot more access, and because there are so many different faculties and other departments across the organization, there is opportunity for greater levels of collaboration in that way. But again, at the same time, going back to the Stephen Lewis Foundation, because we are the organization that I used to work for is a smaller staff, there's also greater opportunities for collaboration in that way as well, because everybody's in the same building. At U of T, I work in a building maybe about the same size as the Stephen Lewis Foundation, but I can be emailing with people across campus that I've never even met, right? And so we can be communicating and collaborating in that way. But at the Stephen Lewis Foundation, there's something nice about being able to just walk down the hall and find the person that you need to talk to. You can get things done quicker, and if they haven't responded to your email for whatever reason, you can find them faster.
So what's your preference, small, big, or
Oh my
that's
gosh,
apples and oranges?
That's really hard. I really did enjoy working at the Stephen Lewis Foundation because it was so small and tight-knit. But there's also something very awesome about working at an organization that is so big, and the opportunity to learn about so many different things that are happening on campus, and also hearing about the stories, and the impact that you're having on the students. I think that's something that I'm kind of gravitating towards more, is being able to see the impact more locally, right there in front of me. And while the Stephen Lewis Foundation does an incredible job of making that connection to people on the continent, there are people from the continent that come and visit and do presentations and things like that. But there is something which I think I probably take for granted at U of T, of being able to walk out onto campus and see the students going to class, and see the classrooms, and go to the library and see so many things happening in real time in front of me in that very moment. So.
I was actually just speaking with someone who's moved from a small organization to a large organization, and she was in awe that when her computer broke down, she could call the IT guy. Bruce, one of the things Imagine Canada has been working on that I have been paying close attention to is the Personal Philanthropy Project, which I know your research has shown that individuals have much larger capacity to give. And so if you can just make a couple of comments on that project and where it's going, and we're still very hopeful that some of this research will turn into action.
Yeah, so sure. So by way of quick background, the Personal Philanthropy Project was really a question about how we could motivate Canadians who earn more than most in that sort of annual income of 100,000 to about $1 million, where the data shows that as a percentage of income, they are contributing less than low, middle, and the super wealthy. And the size of the prize is pretty big. If you look at that group, those who are donating less than 1% of income, if they rose to 1%, and that group that was above 1% just stayed the same, it's $1.6 billion additional dollars into the sector. So we've been doing some research to understand what's going on here. And it's really fascinating. I would boil it down to this. They're really happy with what they give. They gave the same amount 30 years ago and their income has quadrupled. And nothing right now is pushing them into a place of discomfort to think about doing something differently. And so the work that we're doing right now is we actually did kind of some testing of concepts around 1%, 1.5%, gold, silver, bronze. People like you give this. Here's an online giving calculator. And what we discovered was that there was not one construct that knocked it out of the park, but all of them worked. So it speaks to this issue of intentionality. And how can we introduce community-based conversations into people's retirement planning? We even studied the software that a lot of personal financial planners use. And in many cases, when they're talking with their clients about retirement, they talk about travel and kids. There is no line on the software program for community, legacy, whatever you want to call it. So the personal wealth professionals are not even being prompted to have the conversation. So, we kind of view ourselves as system entrepreneurs. So we're about to get really messy and plunge into this and say, is there a way both at a systems level around software, around talking with the thousands upon thousands of individuals who are having conversations with this target audience? And can we go broader from almost a public campaign to reshape a social norm in that group around giving? And so that's the work that is coming.
Great. Well, we're really anticipating it. I agree. I see it with individuals. Some are extremely generous, but there are others that have absolutely huge potential to give, and they're not. Yeah. Or they're buying a $5,000 table at a gala once a year and think they've done their bit, which isn't nearly enough. Okay, a couple of questions, and we're going to open it up to the audience. I'm interested in actually Shireen and Cathy. We've been hearing the word collaboration to the point that we're getting sick of it a little bit, but both of you work in workspaces that are shared, and I'd like you to comment on it and how is it? Who do you share it with? What's it like? And should we see more of this in the sector?
Okay. So the Circle has a desk with the Community Foundations of Canada offices, and that space is shared with the Community Foundations of Canada, the Circle, and the Match International Women's Fund. On the other end, we have Impact Hub Ottawa, so that has many desks and many people that internationally and locally. And the space works great for me, especially because my other half is in Vancouver, in the Vancouver Foundation offices. And so though we work very well online, I think my mind has just been able to, because my family's in Africa maybe, but I can really connect with people through computers. But it is nice to be able to turn around and talk to people and ask them questions about what I'm writing, or have them brainstorm with them if I have a mental block at some point, or even just have coffee with someone, because I think that's something that in this work, you get so invested in the work that you're doing self-care and that ability to have conversations and really get in, like have conversations that are, you had a really difficult part of the day or a great part of the day, to have that is really important. And so I think that's the part that I'm the most thankful about, is just to have these peers around me who actually have my back and know the work that I'm doing really well, because we're so connected. The other piece is collaboration, and just to bring up the word one more time. And I think it's just easier when you're in the same workspace to think about how your projects will intersect. And sometimes it happens very naturally. And I think that's when the collaboration is actually real collaboration, because maybe it's the spontaneous nature of just being like, oh, you're working on a conference next year and I'm working on a gathering, and how can we, where can we change in what we're doing so that we're not doing the same thing, and then how can we work together on different parts to benefit each other and share that to our different audiences.
Great. And it's a cool space too.
It's a great space, yes.
Kathy?
So ONN is located at something called Foundation House in Toronto. So it's a floor of a building that's been renovated. There's 8 foundations, and ONN, I often call us the we poke the side of the foundations. We're the only nonprofit in there. But there's 4 of us that have a team of about 8 to 10, and the other foundations have one or 2 people. So we share IT, we share reception, we share boardrooms, we share kitchen, we share all of our office equipment. We share all of that. And I think what's been fantastic for me, I've been an executive director for a long time, and in my previous role, I was the lease signer. I had to figure out who cleaned the building. I had to figure out what IT system came in when the internet wasn't working. I had to phone the computer person. I had to figure out who would act as receptionist. I pay a monthly rent check. And that is, everything else is taken care of, which is for a small organization as executive directors that have a million jobs to do. I don't have to do that stuff, so I can spend my time more strategically. So certainly a benefit for ONN. But in terms of collaboration, I think at Foundation House it was very intentional from the beginning that yes, there would be accidental collaboration, we hoped, but we also needed to do a better job of making sure we set the groundwork for intentional collaboration. And sometimes it felt like we were having too many conversations about what that would look like, but it has paid off. So for example, when you walk into the kitchen at lunch, the CEO of a foundation is sitting beside, a summer student in another organization, and they're talking about their summer biking plans and the future of the sector. And so the connections that are being made are incredibly meaningful. And there's been some real opportunities. It's only been 2 years. 2 organizations are now sharing financial services. 3 of us are using the same event planner and have negotiated a better deal. We're doing lunch and learn sessions of everything from, today my team was doing one on public policy. There was one on data management in Google Drive, last month. So there's some really concrete, specific ways that we're collaborating and sharing information, and it's, from all accounts, it's been a huge success.
And probably not a terrible thing that you're housed with, 8 funders.
It comes in handy. I think the only reason it's us and not you is because we're not a charity. So they actually can't give us money.
Okay.
But the in-kind support is significant. And I would say, and Bruce has been to the space, they prefer really good caterers.
Yeah,
so it
great.
comes in handy. My team is like, is there a meeting today?
I've actually used your caterer for a board meeting, and it was the same day that you were having a meeting, and so I said to the caterer, well, what are they eating? We'll have the same thing.
Awesome.
Good. Okay, and last question for Gerry, and then I am opening it up to the audience. So, Gerry, you've talked a lot about diversity and inclusion and benchmarks for not-for-profit that you seem to think weren't that prevalent or inexistent. You would talk to me about how for-profit organizations have to do the corporate social responsibility report, and you think there should be some similar report, not the same, but some type of standard report for not-for-profits. Maybe just talk a little bit about it.
Yeah, I think the nonprofit sector really needs to have a conversation about accountability. Not even necessarily about diversity, but about everything that all of us have talked here about this evening, because there's a lot of good ideas, there's a lot of action that is taking place, but I worry that there's a lack of accountability. There's no external, impartial party kind of holding us to a standard and encouraging us to do better. So of course we have the CRA, but that's related to tax regulation, and that's a very specific thing. But with respect to diversity, I can think of a number of organizations that are perhaps doing diversity and inclusion, period, that are doing diversity and inclusion, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they are doing it well, because there are so few organizations doing diversity and inclusion. And so when you also think about organizations where D&I isn't even on their radar for a number of reasons, it might not be a priority for them, and they might not also have capacity for it. But if they are not encouraged to consider the ways that it can actually positively contribute to their organization, they're just going to keep doing the same old, the same old, the same old. And it's unfortunate that organizations are not seeing the value of it, or perhaps don't have the resources or capacity to do it. So I think it goes back to a lot of what Cathy was saying about collaboration. It was so neat to hear about where her organization is located, and that you spoke about collaboration, but I was really pleased to hear about how you're actually walking the talk. That's really important. And so I think as a sector, we need to be doing that as well. And I don't know, maybe this is controversial, but starting another nonprofit to be that accountability arm, I don't know, should we do that or not? But I think there's definitely a place for that to happen, because there's no standard, there is no benchmark right now. I follow a lot of what's going on in the corporate world with respect to D&I, and it seems like a lot of corporations are doing it well. There's standards, there's reports that come out, people have to post and be transparent about their stats and their statistics and the data that they're collecting. And I think if the nonprofit sector could take that on as well, and again, going back to collaboration, why would we need to reinvent the wheel? If we go and we seek out these corporations that are doing this work, even government, they're probably doing it as well, and take pieces of what they're doing and kind of adapt it to make it work for the nonprofit sector, I think that would allow for much, much, much needed potential and growth.
That's a good idea. Great. Well, thank you. So we've got a lot of good brain power up here. I'm going to open the questions up to the audience, and who has a question?
Please, I think she's saying, please use the microphone.
Sorry, can you please, okay, that's great. So everybody can hear, that's terrific.
Thank you very much. So I have a two-part question. I'm going to go back to sort of the original, when Bruce and Cathy were talking about some statistics at the beginning, and how sustainable do you think the current model is, where we have the increasing number of charities and declining, and I'm going to use the term active donor base, because I do believe we have an increasing donor base. It's just they're prospective donors as opposed to active donors. So how sustainable is that? And then part two of my question is, when we look back on what's happened in the last 40 years, what learnings do we have from the way things were done back then? So for example, is there a place for a federated fundraiser? Is there a place for a new kind of United Way, where they are raising the money for these smaller not-for-profit and social services? Is there a place for, and I don't know how many people would remember Miles for Millions, but if you can imagine that walk now instead of the hundreds of small walks that take place in every town every year. And what work or what learnings can we take from the family foundations and the community foundations that are a grant-based foundations? So how sustainable is the current model, and what learnings can we take towards collaboration in the future? Thank you.
Who wants to start?
All right. Okay, I'll begin. Thank you. So to the first one around sustainability, I think that the sector is sustainable if organizations have the courage to adapt and change. You look at even an organization like Imagine Canada, we're a charity. 64% of our revenues now come from earned sources. Okay, we have recognized that the funding climate supporting organizations like ours has changed, and as a result, have modified our behavior and created revenue streams that are likely more sustainable and more predictable. So I think the mission of charities is in nonprofits, and I think this is where also social entrepreneurs come in, social innovators. I think what we really are seeking is a mixed ecology where all of these have the opportunity to thrive, but the classic charity model is in jeopardy if organizations simply seek to repeat what they're doing. At least that's my opinion. The second part is interesting because what can we learn from the past? It's interesting. I actually would like to reframe that a little bit if I could. I think one of the observations that we're seeing both in the contribution of time and money is that of bypassing institutions. And so when you now see that 35% of Canadians participate as citizens in communities but don't count it as volunteerism, and we see the rise of crowdfunding where citizens go online and make appeals for cause-like things, and the growth of that, and the trust shifting from institutions to individuals, I'm not sure that organizations that will raise money on behalf of other organizations is a model that is in time with the almost global anti-institution mindset. And so I think that as organizational leaders seek to evolve, and I think it really also speaks to young people. I mean, we often hear that young people are more interested in causes and missions than organizations. So how do we authentically reach out and engage to support a cause in the way that they can and are interested in? I think these are the questions that organizational leaders need to ask themselves.
That's great, what he said. I think...
You go first next time.
Yeah, okay, deal. You know, I don't think the sector is sustainable as it stands. And I think that, but I do agree with Bruce that it would be sustainable if we change the way we're doing things. So I do think we have to do things differently. I think the way donations and fundraising is changing, the way government grants, there's no, core funding is a bad word out there when you talk to government. There's a lot of ways that we need to adapt and transition. And I also think we need to do a better job at talking to people that are thinking, that registering and running a charity is an easy thing to do, because it's not an easy thing to do. And I think everybody in this room knows it's actually more complex than that. So I think if we go the way that we're going, it won't be sustainable for the sector, and there are things that we can do differently. I have a slightly different opinion on learning from the past, particularly around the role of intermediaries and collaborative efforts. My first job as an executive director was starting a small volunteer center, and the United Way provided ongoing funding to pay the rent and the utilities. And I could never have raised, as a small organization, the amount of funding I got from the United Way. I could never have competed and gone out there with my 2.2 staff people and raised $100,000, which I got annually from the United Way. That model was so helpful to a small nonprofit operating in that environment. And I really worry that if those intermediaries, whether they're funding intermediaries, other intermediaries like volunteer centers, other networks, if the support for those fall, which it is falling, it's really hard to be an intermediary these days, I worry that it will put small to medium-sized nonprofits at risk because they don't have the supports they need, they don't have the staff, and quite frankly, why should they? Not everybody needs a bookkeeper or a full-time administrator, or we need to think about how we do things differently. So I think there's a lot of learning from the past. I also think we need to take a stronger stand and as a sector and say there's a valuable role that intermediaries play in our sector, and we need to figure out how to fund them. So.
Great. Thank you. And we have a question right up in the front here.
Yeah, my question's actually, I was reflecting just on the different points that each person was making. I found it really interesting around this notion of collective efforts versus cause efforts. But then I looked at, reconciliation takes action, diversity, inclusion needs to take action. We need to be more proactive. And Cathy, your points around collaboration. And I think, so what are the major agents that need to change to have this sector make change? Because I'm hearing the trends are great, I think they're bang on, but what is it going to take? Mm-hmm. What is it going to take to make that collective effort happen? Mm-hmm. That's a throw out.
Who would like to take this?
We'll go
Gerry?
this way.
I think I think I'll go back to, our leadership needs to be reflective of the communities that it's serving, right? So traditionally, we know that the majority of nonprofit leaders are white. The majority of nonprofit leaders might be white males. And so if the organizations and the work that they are doing and the services that they are providing are for communities that are not white and communities that are not male, and they're making decisions based on how they situate themselves as a straight white male, they're missing the perspectives and the insights of the people that they are trying to serve, right? So if a straight white male is making a decision for a community of racialized women, I find it, I mean, they're very well-rounded straight white men. I'm not saying that's not possible, but you know, that lived experience as a Black woman, and the services that I need and that I'm seeking to use is very different from a straight white male. And so I think, you know, when you have more perspectives and more diverse perspectives and experiences at a table, then you have a better idea of the services that you need to provide and how to go about that, right? So I think it starts from that. And I think for people in positions of leadership, it's sometimes about knowing when to step away, knowing when to step aside and let different types of leadership come in. I think about the concept of, you know, everyone deserves a seat at the table, and I agree with that, but there's also an understanding that the table is so big and that not everyone can be at the table all the time. And so there's power in actually knowing when you need to give up your seat and give it to someone else and allow other people the opportunity to bring their experience, to bring their voices and their opinions and their insights to the table.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great. You know, I think there's a disconnect sometimes in our sector between the values we hold and the actions that we take. And I don't think it's intentional. I think it's because we are spending so much time doing the work that we're intended to do, or fighting fires, or looking for the next grant, or trying to deal with the latest government policy change. So, and I also think there are times that as a sector that we spend too much time in process and thinking about things and consulting and, you know, maybe, you know, doing a 5-year strategic plan, and we're not as nimble as we need to be. And so the focus on action and actually making mistakes, because some of the worries, and Shireen and I were just having a chat this afternoon about reconciliation and how we can support that work. And I think, you know, our sector is afraid of making mistakes. We have this value that we're going to be this, you know, that we hold that in our communities. And if we go too quick, if we act quickly, we might make a mistake. And the reality is, I think we're not acting on some of these things because we're worried about making mistakes. And so it takes years to change processes and systems and our missions and, you know, how we operate. So it's both about walking the talk to our values and just about, you know, getting stuff done, like just trying to get stuff done. And I think the more we think about, okay, we're going to go out on this, and if we make a mistake, we're going to say, we learned from that, and have a value of continuous learning, the stronger our sector will be.
Yeah, I'd echo both of your points. And I think if I had anything to add, it would be one, the sector knows a lot about each other. Like, we are a community, and you recognize a lot of the same people. And that's great because we have that connection to one another. But it also means we've got the same voices in rotation. So even when we have a number of convenings and conferences over the year, many times it's the same people at every conference, and we're updating each other seasonally, you know? And it's great, and it's a good thing because you see the progression of work, but it also means the same voices and similar ideas. And so it's important to think about when you're doing the consulting work and when you're gathering people for input, if you have the same faces around the table, generally they're all going to be, or the majority is also going to be white, but it's also the same people. So it doesn't even, though race does play a part in it and perspective, it also means you need to realize that knowing someone sometimes doesn't mean that should be at the table. Mm-hmm. And maybe inviting them, like you said, to say, who do you know that could come and attend on your behalf? Another point, the circle, we had an art of hosting in April in the springtime. And one of the things Chris and I really wanted to demonstrate was the room would not be white. It would be majority Indigenous people and racialized people. And so we really did think of the sector, and we're thinking, how are we going to make that happen? We want foundations to attend, but if we do that, then it's going to be off balance, and that's just the natural result. And so we made what we called reciprocity teams. And we said, in order for you, a philanthropic organization staffer, to attend, you have to attend with an Indigenous partner that you work with. and they would pay their tuition, they would arrange their travel and their accommodations, because we couldn't do that on our end as a 2-person team. And when we were I think we both looked at each other and had this moment of like emotions and super excited, because we're sitting in a circle full, and you could see that like it was actually majority racialized or Indigenous people. And it was just this moment to see like it's a small shift, and it's about intentionality and how you invite, and the whole process, I think, added to an extra layer of the event to get like as a gathering.
I think that is great, because I go to a lot of conferences, and often it is the same people at the conferences, and it's a great family reunion, but not maybe the best approach. So that was
the question being who are the stakeholders that could change. I think there's lots probably. The likely right in the line of sight are those who are within the sphere of influence. So maybe I'll offer a slightly different framing on this. One of my personal beliefs, and this is based on no empirical data, is that I think as leadership in the sector, we often lack courage. We lack courage to put tough issues in front of our boards and our staff, and we lack courage to make change, whether it's fundamental or it's minute shifts, because we are a risk-averse sector. We have to succeed. Our fundraisers have to succeed. If we try and reinvent, and it doesn't work, it may sink the entire organization. So there's reasons for it. So for me, the reframing here is, how do we affect the DNA of organizations to invite change agents and seekers of courage into it? So when we think about even just our boards of directors, we look for our accountants and lawyers and people who are passionate about the cause. How many times do we actually go out and say, wouldn't it be great if have you ever actually led or supported a major change initiative in your corporation, in your community, in an organization? And what from that really bothered you or didn't bother you, or you could invite into this conversation? Because of whether it's the way we design programs, how the volunteers that we recruit, the people that we invite in as staff, we're going to have to get uncomfortable to make change. And I think the way to maybe start that process, and I'm really talking about it at a community level, is how do we affect the most senior leadership, which is the boards of directors, and invite different types of people with a mindset shift to come onto those. So
great. Great points, and certainly for-profit organizations make mistakes. I can attest to that. So I don't think that the not-for-profit should be so terrified of getting something wrong. We have time for one more question before we wrap up, and then our panelists will certainly be around informally to chat with you. So our last question.
All right, I'll try to make it short enough, though, or I could auction off the mic to the highest bidder. There's a lot of students with tests coming up. I'm Jason. I'm here from Ottawa. So my question, I'll do my question first. Is there anything in this upcoming social innovation and finance strategy that could maybe help the sector build some of those intermediaries that you talked about? Or is that something that we're going to have to rely on private donations and capital for? And I'll give two items of context before I go back to that question. First is about Cathy, and I really liked your summary of how Ontario's political climate change is changing, and also how you were saying that, the politicians aren't always doing exactly what you thought they were. And that struck home for me when my local MP, Catherine McKenna, the environment minister, had her coffee thing and we got together. She had no idea how many environmental nonprofits in her ward were disappearing, and we were all losing our jobs. And there were more than I could count on my hands, and I have fingers, and I have 2 fingers, or 10 fingers, 2 hands and 10 fingers. There's like 11 organizations dying because of that lack of core and ongoing program support. We had to kill ourselves so that we could apply for new seed and grow grants from one of the big funders. And she was stunned. She had no idea. And that was going on because there is no environmental United Way, like you were mentioning the United Way, because there was political climate change back then, and people got together and said, hey, in Toronto, we need something for the social sector. They're struggling, there's poor people, there's immigrants, well, what are we going to do? There's racism, what are we going to do? And they did the United Way. And there's no environmental United Way giving out small grants or core and ongoing funding for non-profitable environmental projects. There's no local environmental health integration network, right? There's the local health integration network where 2.6 billion comes to 200 different organizations here in the Champlain region to support them to do great work, which is awesome. And even our city here in Ottawa, we give 26 million away to core fund really important environmental social programs. And as an environmental organization, we're saying, oh, we'll adapt the lens so that you can show your social benefits and tap into their funding. But then I'm tapping it like, just so you know, the social sector here in Ottawa, for those not from here, isn't doing the best, right? Like they need that money desperately, and they're doing great work. So I don't want to chip in from their work. So anyways, and then Bruce, I also just quickly enjoyed your courage to adapt and change. I feel bad that you didn't do your TripAdvisor rating system for charities, because the technology now, it's not about should we do it, it's should we do this project to apply our lens, or let somebody else take it on? Because I've already given Imagine Canada, while I was sitting there, 2 reviews, great reviews, one on Google Maps of all places, and one on Facebook. I could rank you and rate you and I even added stories, and I could leave a link to MPNL for the Philanthropy and nonprofit leadership program. So I won't charge a commission if you get a new student. I won't charge a commission if you get a new monthly donor. But I hope it was a good review. But anyways, is there anything in this new social innovation and financing strategy that could help build those intermediaries that are so important for environmental, non-profitable work?
Okay. So I've had the good fortune of getting a preview on the yet to be released report. So there's 6 recommendations coming. I wouldn't say that there is a specific recommendation that addresses the question, particularly around intermediaries. However, there are recommendations that will lend themselves well to both supporting a modernization of the regulatory regime, which I think there's real alignment in this case between the social innovation and social finance world and the charity and nonprofit world. And together we're now working to try and push this across the finish line. We're literally mapping the recommendations coming from these various reports, and they're all starting to fall into alignment. I think if there's an unleashing of power here, it's likely, it could be intermediaries, but it's certainly not targeted at them. It's more targeted at inventors for social purpose organizations in their communities, and seeing if capital can be unleashed to help them in their work.
Great. Well, thank you, and thank you to our panelists, Bruce, Shireen, Cathy, and Gerry. Terrific insights. We've had great audience, but as I said, we're going to shortly move, and the party continues or starts. So I'd like to invite Graham up to make some final closing remarks.
Thank you all for being here this evening, and thanks again to the panel for a wonderful conversation covering a vast array of issues that the sector that is quite diverse confronts. And just to close, I wanted to really highlight a few things that struck me that I think is really telling of the richness here. One is the nature of the fact that we're dealing with a sector where there is a great amount of diversity that exists, but that internal to that sector, there is a challenge of trying to recognize where it is not diverse. So there's this something inside the sector that needs to be addressed as a consequence, and how to coordinate that, this sort of challenge of moving collectively when there is so much diversity. And what is the collective purpose of the sector as a whole? Where are there collective purposes that can be struck, and coordination that can accomplish those collective objectives? And I think the last 2 things that I'd say that I think are really telling is this idea that this is a long-term game, that the playing for the long run, that there may be many setbacks along the way, that a government will change, priorities will shift, but that isn't necessarily what anyone's eyes should be on. It should be, what does this mean for realigning, rethinking how resources, expertise, commitments, relationships can be reworked, repurposed, such that that long game can be still the game that's being pursued. And that I think Cathy's point about the fact that that the system is everyone here, that is a sort of an empowering notion that the people in this room can be the agents of change that shift what that system is in 5 years' time and 10 years' time with that long-term vision in mind. And so I was very grateful to be here this evening to learn from all of you and participate in this wonderful event. And so thank you for coming, and thank you for engaging with the school and Carleton University. And I look forward to interacting with many of the students in the room in the coming years and to the community more largely through the program and through the school.